Hi class, my name is Jason Wilson, and for my second and final presentation, I chose to do a bit of research on the economics behind homelessness in America, more specifically the causes and potential solutions to homelessness. So this topic is of particular interest to me right now because of my study of the homeless for a political science course. This project kind of allows me to combine my study of both courses, which is kind of cool. So the title of my article is The Economics of Homelessness, the Evidence from North America. It's by John M. Quigley and Stephen Raphael from UC Berkeley. It was published in the European Journal of Housing Policy, Volume 1, Number 3, and it was written in 2001. The article is around 12 pages long. I enjoy researching things that are not necessarily at the forefront of the popular or political agenda, things that are kind of generally just accepted and not really questioned. And so, for my first article critique, I talked about the economics of online crime. Because people acknowledge that it's a problem, but they're unwilling to solve it or acknowledge the economic reasoning behind it. And I strongly believe that the same is true for homelessness. Okay, so the primary focus of this article is to introduce traditional American hypotheses as to the origin of homelessness, and then to debunk these theories and replace them with more reputable and supported theories. The article talks about how it is traditionally believed that homelessness has been increasing because of the deinstitutionalization, the decrease of hospitalization of the mentally ill, and increased substance abuse. Now, this article, however, is able to prove that homelessness is more directly tied to the affordability of housing markets and the unequal distribution of income. So in critiquing the article, I want to start with my objective view and then move more into my subjective agreements and disagreements. So first of all, I'm very satisfied with the organization of the article, even more so than the online crime article from my previous critique. So this article certainly was more concise and to the point, and the authors did not introduce bias into their explanations. All arguments were supported by reputable data figures, which appear throughout the article and add validity to the structure. By reading the article, it's very, very difficult to glean the opinions of the authors on the topic, which is a very good thing. So a scholarly economics article is a time to present your findings, and not necessarily one's own social opinions. Now, the author's statements are clear, and they avoid ambiguity pretty well. They avoid confusion. So both the abstract and introduction are short and concise, whereas the two main sections of information kind of build upon the concepts identified in the introduction, providing more specific data to back up the claim that homelessness is related to the success of the housing market. So I also felt that the conclusion was a good review of the information and arguments presented in the bulk of the article. My only complaint about the article format is an inadequate explanation of the utilized mathematical models. So what do I mean by that? So the authors frequently refer to regression analysis and multivariable functions, which are scarcely defined or explained in the article, and requires a lot of prerequisite knowledge, honestly, that kind of places an understanding barrier between the authors and the reader. Now, the authors do put a few notes for further explanation at the end of the article, but these notes would for sure not suffice for explanation to a novice. They don't explain really that much more. So, I understand that this is an article, it's not a lecture, okay? But the authors could have included an in-text citation or reference to redirect the reader to where they could learn more about these mathematical formulas. And while I was able to pretty much interpret the main ideas in the article, the complex vocabulary and the ill-explained concepts certainly provided a barrier in fully understanding the tables and figures, especially under the housing markets and homelessness section. I would also like to simply discuss the main points the authors make within the article to back up their hypothesis. Now, as I already mentioned a little bit earlier, the preconceived consensus, the traditional hypothesis, has been to avoid blaming the housing market for homelessness, and instead to blame decreased participation in mental institutions and increased substance abuse. But the authors show that this just doesn't hold up against scrutiny. The authors, they say, wait a minute, patient hospitalization rates have been decreasing since the mid-1950s, and homelessness has only really been recognized as a problem since the 80s. So there's a lack of continuity here. It doesn't add up. The authors show that many of the patients removed from these mental institutions are then placed in other facilities, unfortunately, like the prison system. The number of people left on the streets from this deinstitutionalization is far lower than the number of documented homeless individuals. And keep in mind that this number of homeless individuals is probably much higher than that which is actually reported, because the homeless are extremely hard to track. They have no place of living. A lot of times they don't have any documentation. So also, the authors indicate that the tendency to talk about substance abuse among homeless people is kind of a way to just excuse the often unorganized housing market. They use it as an excuse. And these arguments actually make a lot of sense from an economic standpoint, right? So the owners and landlords of housing markets, of course, do not want to blame themselves, okay? Now, using marginal analysis, they realize that, lowering the costs for rent, and thus lowering the rent-to-income ratio for low-income families, would raise their marginal costs above their marginal benefits, right? So that would lower their overall utility. And this is a good economic proof the authors use to show that the housing market is the real problem for increased homelessness. Now, in the face of dealing with increased rent-to-income ratio because of renters' unwillingness to create rents of lower quality, those in the working class must also make decisions which are in their rational self-interest. Okay, not only the renters, but also the rentees, those who are of the lower class, they're also acting out of their rational self-interest and their economic self-interest. Now, at this point, I would like to quote the article here, because I think this is a really good point. So the authors say, the choice is between consumption of a very low-quality housing that absorbs a large portion of income, or increased consumption of other necessities with zero housing expenditures. So in other words, the homeless recognize that the cost for such low-quality living is outweighing the meek benefits. And so their funds would create greater utility if used for water, food, and other less expendable commodities. Okay, housing is more of an expendable commodity. You don't need it to survive. And I'm really glad that the authors bring up this point, because it leads to a really significant revelation. If you think about it, the excuses that people use for the increase of homelessness, i.e. the mentally ill abusing substances, is not the driving factor for the creation of homelessness, but instead is a byproduct of homelessness. So homelessness creates this low style of living. It is not this deplorable style of living which creates homelessness. Now, this brings me to one final criticism of the article. I felt that the authors underemphasized the significance of the economic motivations to ignore the direct relationship between tight housing markets and homelessness. Now, this certainly goes beyond landlords' unwillingness to expand and build a greater number of low-income housing spaces. The problem also is the consensus of the middle class, the upper middle class, and the upper class, who already own nice homes. These people don't want the inconvenience of development or the pollution it creates. They are happy with the way things are. I see this all the time in San Luis Obispo. People tell me they don't want increase in housing. They don't want the development. Now this is a present day embodiment of economic elitism. Now I believe that the authors are correct when they say in the introduction that homelessness could be reduced by creating public policies to make housing markets respond more freely to changes in demand. Now, branching off of this idea, I believe that this issue could be mitigated by government-provided subsidies to housing owners, giving them incentive to expand their business. Now, as the authors say in their conclusion, it really doesn't take that much of a change. Okay, so they say that 1/4 of homelessness in America could be mitigated, could be reduced by an increase of only 1% in vacancy rate, which is kind of crazy. So, thank you for listening and watching my critique. I will be interested to hear your opinions in the discussion section. Thank you.